Hi, I'm Mike Hudson, Director of the Museum of the American Printing House for the Blind. Welcome to the Redux presentation of sessions from the Hidden Legacies of Helen Keller Symposium, which was held in Louisville, Kentucky on September 17th and 18th, 2022. The symposium, with primary sponsorship from the American Printing House for the Blind and the Filson Historical Society, brought together scholars, writers, and Keller enthusiasts from across North America. In 2020, the American Foundation for the Blind Helen Keller Archive arrived at our museum on 23 pallets. And since then, our staff has been busy cataloging, describing, measuring, and inventorying this most amazing history of one of the most amazing women of the 19th and 20th centuries. I'm sitting in front of her desk from her house at Arcan Ridge. Helen Keller was a writer, activist, advocate, ambassador, and world traveler who profoundly affected the way the world thinks about people with disabilities. And yet, she is little understood, often frozen in time as a little girl with her hand under the water pump behind her parents' home in Tuscumbia, Alabama. Our symposium was just a beginning effort to bring together the most current scholarship in innovative ways to better understand Keller, her companion Anne Sullivan, and her times. We hope you enjoy the series. Each session will be dedicated to a single speaker from the symposium. Our first session on Saturday morning was titled Curiosity, Pedagogy, and Tools, and looked at the history of education and literacy for people who are blind or deafblind from three very different perspectives. Our second speaker in that session was Dr. Leona Godin, who teaches at NYU, looking at the roots of literacy at the first school for people who are blind in the world and the obstacles the Braille system experienced and her own experiences with Braille. Dr. Godin was interested in literacy and the very different ideas that people had about what was the best system, the perfect system. And Dr. Godin has her own personal journey to Braille and literacy. Leona Godin is a writer, performer, and educator, and the author of There Plant Eyes, A Personal and Cultural History of Blindness. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Playboy, O Magazine, Electric Literature, Catapult, and other publications. She produced 2 plays, The Star of Happiness, about Helen Keller's time performing in vaudeville, and The Spectator and the Blind Man, about the invention of Braille. She wrote the script for The Worlds We Live In, a forthcoming documentary about blind culture and community for the American Foundation for the Blind. She holds a PhD in English and teaches literature and humanities courses at New York University. Her online magazine, exploring the arts and sciences of smell and taste, Aromatica Poetica, publishes writing and art from around the world.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. We have got a lot of ground to cover in this talk, from the first school for the blind in 18th century Paris, to the invention of Braille, to the prejudices Braille's system faced in his time and still faces today. Finally, I'll turn to Keller's heartfelt and beautiful words that speak to her relationship to Braille and to books which resonate with the sentiments of many blind people who use and love Braille with a fervor that is often overlooked by sighted educators. In 1771, a young man named Valentin Hauy, I'm going to call him Howie, if that's okay with you, was strolling down a Paris street when he found himself at St. Ovid's Fair. A raucous crowd was jeering and cheering 10 blind men who were wearing dunce caps and asses' ears and mock playing broken cellos and violas. Stands of music faced the audience, who were banging tankards and drunkenly dancing. There were even cheap playbills with some lines of tasteless verse to promote the event. It lasted a month. Now, Howie was horrified by the spectacle, which was dubbed the Cafe of the Blind. In response, he vowed to substitute the truth for this mockery. Okay, I'm not going to do any more French accents. And make the blind read. Seeing the spectacle prompted him to make a promise to himself. I will put in their hands volumes printed by themselves. They will trace the true characters and will read their own writing, and they will be enabled to give harmonious concerts. Then, with a theatrical flourish, he addresses the impresario, the presumably sighted man who had gathered and costumed his blind performers and advertised their show. Yes, atrocious maligner, whoever thou art, the ears of the ass with which thou wouldst degrade the head of misfortune shall be attached to thine own. As a man of the Enlightenment, Howie saw something in the Cafe of the Blind that others in the presumably uneducated or poorly educated crowd could not. Though Howie came from a modest country home, thanks in large part to his brilliant brother, he received an excellent education. He followed that brother to Paris, where both became immersed in the arts and sciences of the day. An orthographer by trade, Howie specialized in deciphering ancient handwriting. His brother was a mineralogist and eventually helped him to gain the attention of the intellectuals of Paris, whom he would need to open his school for the blind, the first of its kind in the world. Although Howie conceived his idea to educate the blind at the Café of the Blind in 1771, it was another kind of spectacle, a more gentrified kind, 13 years later, that gave him the final push to realize his dream, and that push came in the form of a girl, a Viennese musical prodigy named Maria Theresia von Paradis. He would meet her in 1784 when she was on a European tour. She was performing and demonstrating her tactile methods of education, and their meeting would finally convince him of the viability of his plan. Sadly, we don't have time to dive into Paradis's colorful life. If you're interested in learning more about her and the whole sexy history of the education of the blind, may I suggest picking up a copy of Their Plant Eyes, a personal and cultural history of blindness. I had to stick a plug for my book in there somewhere. In short, thanks to his visit to Paradis's performance and demonstration, Howie picked up practical methods, particularly the use of carved block letters to teach the alphabet by touch. And that was the final push that he needed to put his teaching the blind plan into action. Now Howie went out in search of his first student. He found Francois Le Sœur, but I'm going to just call him Francois, begging on the church steps. Francois was 17 years old and had been blind since the age of 6 weeks. His family was extremely poor, and he had never had any education. Now, Francois did not exactly jump at the opportunity for education offered by Howie, as he was not ready to give up his profitable post on the church steps during the Pentecostal season. So Howie promised to pay him for his time. Isn't that fantastic, to be paid, to be educated? Howie first taught his student to recognize letters using carved wooden tablets. But this was a labor-intensive method, as each new page had to be carved. So it turns out that it was actually the student, rather than the teacher, who hit upon the next important innovation. Sorting through some papers on Howie's desk one day, Francois found the back of an invitation card, and he was surprised by the feel of the letter O. It was embossed type that had been impressed from front to back on the thick paper, and he ran to his teacher to tell him what he'd found. Howie immediately recognized the usefulness of this discovery. He traced more letters in reverse so that they could be read on the backside, and Francois named them all. It did not take Howie long to realize that the method was as old as the printing press. He merely had to reverse the block letters that ordinarily stamped ink onto paper from the top and make them big enough that the fingers could feel from left to right on the reverse, the blocks with their embossed letters now stamping tactile impressions from beneath. Now, although the type would undergo many changes over the years, Howie had initiated the art of embossing, which led to the creation of the first library for the blind. After that, Francois' education moved more rapidly. In 6 months, he could read and print characters in relief. And now that Howie had his method, he set about getting support and more students. He turned to the Philanthropic Society for both financial assistance and help with gathering his first students. These were 6 blind children who were pensioners. They received free education, room, and board. Now, the real innovation of Howie's school had everything to do with the new enlightened ideals that encouraged all children to have an education. Howie was not the first to make a blind child literate, but he was the first to create a school that attempted to keep middle class and poor children from ending up as beggars, to encourage these children to make a living. Now, it didn't work out perfectly. Many of the children still wound up on the streets or back at the hospice for the blind, as even Francois himself would eventually do. But the endeavor was utterly novel and led to lasting results. Inspired by Howie's ultimately short-lived success, schools for the blind sprang up around the world in the coming decades. Howie's school, the Royal Institute for Blind Youth, opened its doors in Paris in 1785. Soon it was one of the sights of the City of Light. Now, the fashionable and intellectual aristocratic people of Paris flocked to see the blind children demonstrate their newfound literacy and their musical talents. In the winter of 1786, Howie's students were even invited to Versailles for the Christmas festivities. Now, many of you are historians and have likely taken note that these years are rather ominous ones for Howie's royal and aristocratic patrons. His school hardly had a moment to flourish before the French Revolution erupted, and the benevolent aims of progress were nearly forgotten in all the bloodshed. With so many of its rich patrons beheaded, the Paris school fell on hard times, and it would struggle on without Howie, who found himself on the wrong side of the revolution. 20 years later, in 1809, Louis Braille was born in Couvray, a town 25 miles east of Paris. His childhood home is now a museum, and it's very near Disneyland Paris, in case any of you are interested, and having a double trip. His family home had only 2 rooms, one upstairs and one downstairs, where the Brailles lived and worked. Part of the downstairs room was partitioned off as a workshop. The workshop belonged to Braille's father, who was a harness maker, and it was in this workshop that little Braille blinded himself at the age of 3 in 1812. Now, I had always thought that Braille blinded himself with a little awl, a tool that eerily presaged the tool that he would use to invent his alphabet. But no, instead it was a little sharp, curved knife that was rather like a small pruning hook that he was using to poke holes in a leather strap, trying to imitate his father. The knife slipped and he stabbed himself in the eye. Yeah. Before the days of antibiotics, the eye grew infected and it spread to the other eye, leaving Braille blind. It seems to me that the accident arose out of an effort of industry, and that impulse seems to be part of Braille's DNA. Besides the harness-making business, Braille's family ran a small vineyard and was, it seems, thrifty and hardworking. His family was not rich, but they were not illiterate, and a friend tells the story of how Louis Braille learned the alphabet at an early age by feeling letters nailed into a wooden board. Now, Braille was allowed to go to school and proved himself intelligent. The local priest managed to secure a place for him at the Institute for Blind Youth in Paris. This was in 1819 when Braille was 10 years old, and this was years after Howie had been ousted for the school that he had founded. But as it turns out, it was neither Howie nor Braille that came up with the idea of using embossed dots rather than lines to create a tactile writing system. That invention is generally credited to Charles Barbier de la Serre, who was a former artillery officer in Napoleon's army, and he had an interest in cryptography. Barbier invented a system that he called écriture nocturne, night writing, a means by which military intelligence could be read in the dark without lighting a torch and without alerting the enemy. His system was never employed in Napoleon's or any other army's warfare toolkit, but he thought that it might be useful to the blind. So Barbier first brought his night writing to the Institute for Blind Youth in 1820 when Braille was 11, but it was met with resistance from the director, who would soon be forced out due to a scandalous affair with the head music instructress. And Barbier returned in 1821 when his system was more favorably greeted by the new director, which was Braille's friend and mentor through the many years of his directorship. That was Pinier. And he was later forced out not because of romantic affairs, but by finding himself on the wrong side of the governing powers in those volatile decades after the French Revolution. And I think that this reminds us that blind education does not exist in a vacuum, political or otherwise. At the time of Barbier's visit, the students were still learning how to read using the system that Howie had pioneered years before, basically embossed Latin characters. These letters were very bulky, they were hard to read, and they were difficult to write. Barbier's system was also pretty bulky, but the improvement of dots over lines was obvious as they were more readily comprehended by touch. And not only were dots easier to read, but they were also easier to write by using a few simple tools that we now usually refer to as a slate and stylus. So Barbier's system had some drawbacks, and one was that it was sonographic, so it was based on assigning symbols to sounds rather than letters. And another problem was its size. Night writing was based on a combination of 12 dots, which was too big for the finger to glide over from left to right, and it required some vertical movement as well. And this, of course, slowed down the reading process. Barbier left samples of his punctiform writing and some of his tools that he used at the Institute, and so Braille began to tinker and improve the system. He would continue to augment and perfect his system for many years, but he invented the writing system named for him by the ripe old age of 15. What did you do when you were 15? His two great innovations, I don't want to talk about what I was doing when I was 15. His two great innovations were to cut the cell in half, and that was from a 12-dot cell to a 6-dot cell, and to assign dot formations to letter to the alphabet. And Braille's system, simple and elegant, which he also developed into a musical notation system, because Braille was a professional church organist as well, is still the alphabet that we learn today. What's generally called grade 1 Braille includes the letters of the alphabet, the numbers and punctuation. Contractions such as the sound, THE, and the for sign, FOR sign, are used in grade 2, which is the standard for most books in order to save space and increase reading speed. Now, Braille is about as small as it can be for our human fingers to comprehend, but is still pretty bulky. That said, in this digital age, the Braille display and the ubiquity of ebooks makes the issue of bulk nearly moot. In 2009, the anniversary of Louis Braille's birth, the National Federation of the Blind published a report called The Braille Literacy Crisis in America, outlining the obstacles that blind children and adults encounter in learning Braille, and the disadvantages experienced by those who do not learn it. Now, two depressing statistics noted were that fewer than 10% of the 1.3 million people who are legally blind in the United States are Braille readers, and a mere 10% of blind children are learning it. It seems that low Braille literacy rates are at least partly attributable to an unwillingness or perceived inability among teachers and schools to provide instruction. The mostly sighted teachers of blind and visually impaired children are generally overworked, and it's simply easier for them to teach what they know, and they often do not know Braille. Sighted teachers' inability to read Braille and their unwillingness to learn it often cause them to underestimate its power and worth, even to form prejudices against it. Now, this is a bias that goes right back to the days of Louis Braille. In 1840, Braille was a teacher at the school where he had been a student, and he had published his system in 1829. He and the other blind teachers and students were using it to great benefit. Then the director, who was Braille's friend and mentor, was forced to retire, and his deputy took over, and this new director, Monsieur Dufault. Yes, Mike, you did steal my thunder. I even had a little boo written into my speech, so, great minds think alike. So Monsieur Dufault had his own system of embossed characters, and in order to ensure that it replaced the system that Howie had pioneered, he, ordered the burning of all previously embossed books. And while he was at it, the evil Dufault banned the use of Braille's dot system as well. So like so many sighted people then and now, Dufault believed that blind people should use the same or as close to the same reading and writing techniques as those with eyesight. When Louis Braille died in 1852, there was no guarantee that his writing system was going to dominate the blind literacy landscape. By the end of the 19th century, there were several other tactile systems in use, among them New York Point, which was a kind of dot system that laid the cells on its side, Boston Line Type, a modified version of Howie's system, and Moon Type, a kind of shorthand version of Latin characters consisting of minimal curves and lines, named for its inventor, William Moon. And if you visit the APH Museum tomorrow, I think you can get your hands on pretty much all of those systems. However, 100 years later, on the anniversary of his death, Braille was established and beloved around the world, and France finally decided to honor one of its most famous men. They did this by disinterring his remains, which were originally buried in his hometown of Couvray, and placed them in the Paris Pantheon. Helen Keller was there to declare, "We, the blind, are indebted to Louis Braille as mankind is to Gutenberg." And the world was there to witness hundreds of white canes tapping along the streets of Paris with the coffin of Louis Braille in what the New York Times called a strange, heroic procession. Now that was 1952. About 30 years before that, Helen Keller was performing on the vaudeville circuit from the years 1920 to 24. I know, I wish I could do a whole nother presentation on Helen Keller on the vaudeville stage. But during those performances, she and Annie Sullivan fielded questions from the audience. One of these hundreds of questions was, "Who are your best pals?" And her answer, "Books." During those vaudeville years, Helen had a lot of admirers, and she wrote a letter to one of those admirers. She wrote, this was actually a suitor who had asked her, to marry him, very oddly. So, letter to the suitor, she says, "In some respects, my life has been a very lonely one. Books have been my most intimate companions." There can be no doubt that Helen Keller derived a great deal of pleasure from the solitary communion of reading, and that much of this pleasure was escapist, she freely admits in her book Midstream. "More than at any other time, when I hold a beloved book in my hand, my limitations fall from me. My spirit is free. Books are my compensation for the harms of fate. They give me a world for a lost world, and for mortals who have disappointed me, they give me gods." Books supplied what Keller's missing senses could not, but they also supplemented the world's lack. Failure and frailty, greed and indifference could never be totally got over in this world, but in the world of books, men and women could live the lives of heroes. Keller was by no means misanthropic, but she did find room for improvement. She was a card-carrying socialist and political activist, and in 1913, she published a book of essays called Out of the Dark, which railed against capitalist greed and demanded social reformation. Her decidedly leftist politics angered many people who saw her radical outspokenness as abhorrent and antithetical to their angelic ideal of her. If her politics were radical, her literary tastes were perhaps less so, and yet there were so few books available to her. She didn't have the luxury of electronic books or of searching vast databases. She necessarily relied heavily on other people to tell her about new books and authors. Often she had to have them transcribed for her, which was expensive and time-consuming. Sometimes the easiest, if least satisfactory method was simply to have someone read a book to her by spelling into her hand. This meant she would not be able to refer back to it. Once read, it was lost. But there were other ways of losing precious Braille books. She wrote, "I cannot take space to name here all the books that have enriched my life, but there are a few that I cannot pass over. The one I have read most is the Bible. I've read and reread it until in many parts the pages have faded out. I mean, my fingers have rubbed off the dots and I must apply whole verses from memory, especially the Psalms, the Prophets, and the Gospels." I'd like to end today by quoting a passage that speaks to both her passion for reading and the difficulties she often experienced in getting her hands on the books that her sighted companions could obtain so easily. This is about Joseph Conrad. "I did not really make his acquaintance until 1920. I did not have any of his books in Braille until then. I cannot define the peculiar fascination he has for me, but he took possession of me at once. I had always loved books of the sea, and the days I have spent along the shore have been happy ones. I love the dunes and the seaweeds that drift and crawl up onto the sands, the little waves that creep through shell and pebbles like fingers seeking to spell a message to me. We used to be friends when you were the beginning of a fish. Do you remember? I love winds and storms and sailors, tropical dawns leaping out of the east, and billows that like mighty tusked mastodons crunch the land. It may be that I am especially alive to the spell of the sea because it is so much like darkness that is my element. The dark, too, has its deep, silent currents and silent reefs, dangerous reefs, its monsters, creatures of beauty, derelicts, and ships. In the dark, too, there is a star to steer by, And no matter how far I travel, there are always before me vast oceans of experience that I have not yet explored. Thank you for coming along on this Braille adventure with me, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks a lot.